Welcome back. The wait is finally over, and this is the moment you've all been waiting for. Or at least some of you, maybe one of you, were waiting for. Well, after over 2 years of absence, QubaHQ Tutorials are finally back for Season 2, and what a way we have to start that new season. Chromatic Aberration Rig. Something that I've been meaning to share with you for quite a while now. I think I originally announced it over 5 months ago, so again a long wait, followed by a whole bunch of cool other tutorials I have planned for the coming weeks and months. Why don't we jump right in? Much like the stop motion kit, the Chromatic Aberration Rig was originally designed as a series of expressions that the user would have to apply to a number of carefully named layers, paying close attention to the order in which the effects are being applied, the layer stacking, which layer goes above, which below, and while the effect itself worked just fine, it was not the most elegant solution. The whole thing was very prone to errors. It was enough to misspell just a single letter in one of the layer names and the whole thing would fall apart. The expressions would stop linking to where they needed to link, the information wasn't passed from one layer to another, and generally it was not a very user-friendly solution. So weeks and months passed, and the effect I so over-eagerly announced was just sitting on my hard drive, not ready for release. And that's when I remembered that expressions are not the only automation system that After Effects offers. There is also scripting. The only problem was that I didn't know anything about how to even approach scripting, and honestly I was quite intimidated by it. But after viewing a few websites, I realized that it uses a very similar language structure to expressions itself, and it took me only a day or so to crack it open and have the first prototype of chromatic aberration working. After a few more revisions, I had it popping out dialogues and offering pre-compositions. You will see it for yourself in just a moment. Overall, from a process that would take around 5, maybe 6 minutes to apply, right now the entire effect can be applied to your footage with a single click, and it couldn't be easier. But before I serve the dessert, I would like to offer you some vegetables. That is a bit of theory about what is chromatic aberration, how is it usually represented in video, and why I felt the need to create this particular rig. Much like the beloved lens flares, chromatic aberration, also known as lens fringing, is actually a mistake, and it's caused by imperfections in the design of the lenses. An ideal lens would capture the light and then refocus all the wavelengths of that light in a single spot on a photosensitive film or a microchip. And that is usually the case with most of the lenses used in the professional film and video production these days. But if you use slightly older lenses, and especially the cheaper ones, you will notice that there are slight differences in the way the light refracts through the center and the edges of the optical elements inside them. So in the center of your image, you would have all the colors perfectly aligned, but as your eyes travel towards the edges, you're gonna notice this cool fringing effect that is actually a mistake, but became now a part of the filmic language, a part of the film vocabulary, and is often used as a post effect to give CG or other artificially created images a sense of reality, a sense of being actually captured by real lenses. So typically how this effect is achieved in post is simply by splitting your image into 3 separate channels and then distorting them in different ways. So this black and white render of the moon and the Milky Way in the back is actually a composite of red, green and blue channels in here. And if I grab just one of them and scale it just horizontally so that it mismatches the others, you will start seeing that in the center of the image everything seems still fine, but the further we go towards the edges, the more of the fringing we get. Now, we can do it with a single channel, or we can apply it to a number of channels to create even deeper effect. And you can see that we're almost getting kind of a rainbow streaking effect in here. But that is not quite correct. Now, this is a very simple example using just the scaling. What I typically prefer to do is using some sort of spherical distortion such as CC lens for it. And how I would do that would be to just go to the effects and go to the CC lens, apply it to one of the channels and set my size at 100 so that I can see that it reaches the corners of the image and doesn't create a sphere, and then lower the convergence to a fairly low number, let's say 2. At this point I can copy this effect from here and paste it on another channel and apply a different number, perhaps -2. So again, actually -2 is not a very good idea. Let's try 1. So again, we start getting a very similar effect where all the colors separate towards the edges while maintaining a perfect alignment in the center. The advantage over the scaling is that the whole thing happens spherically, so we start losing that color focus as we come towards the edges. And you can observe this kind of look on many different videos, either from myself even or from some of the most famous film studios, and everything would be fine if not for the fact that light doesn't really work this way. So you're probably familiar with this iconic design. This is the cover of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album, and it shows something that we're dealing in here. So stream of light comes into the lens object, and because of the way its geometry is designed, gets separated into separate wavelengths. This is a very graphic representation, and how the light looks is a bit more like this, right? So there is no hard edges between the colors, they are very soft. But if the light was to behave in the way we just demonstrated, the prism would look something like this, because we would end with very well-defined, sharp parts that represent different, completely separate wavelengths. And the result that we're trying to get is much closer to this when one color smoothly passes into another. And in order to achieve that, I created the Chromatic Aberration Rig, which refines its result depending on how much processing power you're willing to allocate to it. So why don't we jump in and have a look? I have the footage already loaded in here. I'm going to create a new composition and apply the effect. If you're watching this tutorial on my site, QubaHQ.com, then the link to the script itself is in the same article as the video. If you're on YouTube, on Vimeo, just have a look at the description and that should link you to the proper article. And once you've downloaded it, you'll probably need to unzip it, and you can either place it wherever you want, or as I did, you can put it in your After Effects scripts folder. So let's just assume you extracted it to some other place. You would go to File, Scripts, Run Script File, and then select QubaHQ Chromatic Aberration version 1.2 or maybe 1.3 or so if I decide to update it in the future. But I'm not going to do it. Instead, I'm going to run it right from the menu because I already copied it to my scripts directory and it loads together with After Effects. So you simply click it and you get a script alert. So what does it say? You don't have any layers selected. You must have composition with a single selected source layer to apply chromatic aberration. And yes, that's my bad. So let's say the system is a 2-click process. First click, select your source layer. Second click would be run the script. Boom. And as soon as you do so, you will see that we have a result very similar to what I was just showing you. So we have an image that looks quite fine in the center, but as we scroll towards the edges, we get that separation. And you may say, Kuba, you know, you've been telling us all about the spectrum and showing us album covers, and this is exactly the same thing that you're warning us against. Yes, this is the starting point of the effect. If you look in your timeline, right now, the layer that we had selected has been renamed to Chromatic Aberration Source, And on top we have a controller with all these cool controls, and then we have chromatic aberration end, which is just a black layer to serve as a background. Now, just before we start playing with all the settings, notice that some of the effects have their name listed just as is, while some have the word auto added in the beginning. And when you see this auto writing, that means that you cannot manually modify the effect, that it is already a result of a calculation. So especially when you click on the source and all the effects that have been applied in there, all of them are marked as automatic. And that means the script and the expressions are going to take care of determining the values for this layer. So I mentioned a moment ago that the quality of your render result will depend on the amount of processing power you're willing to devote to the system. What I mean by this is, by duplicating your source layers, you will be able to refine the result further and further. So at the moment we have 2 copies of the source, and they represent the 2 different colors you can see. But if I select this one and hit Ctrl D on my keyboard to duplicate it, you will notice that right now we have 3 layers in here and 3 colors on our screen. We can now select all of them and create a copy, ending up with 6 layers and much more visible streaking appearing in here. And you can trust me on this one, this happens all around the image. Now, it still doesn't look quite correct, we still get those dots, but the effect is already starting to look much cooler than the standard chromatic aberration you may be used to. So let's make 3 more copies of that layer. And right now we have 9 dots per streak, and this is starting to look pretty fine, especially in the middle ground here, but towards the edges it's still not quite perfect. Whoops, I should not be moving any of the layers. Let me zoom in and pan around so we can still see those separate dots here. And you may wonder, you know, if I created a script that can easily duplicate your layer, why doesn't it just create enough copies to avoid the streaking? Well, it all depends on the settings you would be using. So if I very quickly jump to the controller right now, you will notice that we're using the lens distortion of 5. And if I lower the lens distortion to, let's say, 2, now these 9 dots are quite enough to create the appearance of a streak rather than separate dots. However, if I bump it up to 10, everything looks like a bad motion blur with not enough samples. So at this point you would have 2 solutions. Either continue increasing the amount of your source copies, and we can totally do that. Right now we're at 9. How about we just do 1, 2, 3 more copies? So, you know what, I'm really bad at math at this point, but I think that's 27, and that should be perfectly sufficient. Let's see, it's taking quite a while to render. And I had to edit the video in here because it was really rendering for nearly a minute. I think it may be all the recording software that I have running in the background caching onto the same hard drive. And the results are quite beautiful. I mean, just look at this. This is straight out of either Star Trek or Star Wars or some other space opera. But I mean, who wants to spend 1 minute of render time on a single chromatic aberration frame? So let's get back to some more manageable number, like let's say 9. And there is another option for making it smoother. So if you don't want to increase the number of layers you're using, you have this thing called blur boost. And this is going to use radial blur to streak each of those images separately to compensate for the space. So let's just increase the amount of blur to, let's say, 2, and you can see that the result is quite similar, achieved with just 9 layers. So this is basically up to you which method you're going to use. Sometimes when you have too many layers and too strong of a blur, this may slow you down much more than duplicating the amount of layers. Sometimes the blur will be a better solution. Again, it's a matter of choice. Okay, where were we? We were talking about other settings, right? So we have the blur boost and we have the blur quality. So If we lower it, and I think the minimum in here is 10, you'll see that the streaking comes back a little bit. And again, you can adjust this thing to taste just to see what's your ideal setting that finds this fine medium between the time spent rendering and the quality. I like to keep the quality at 100 and maybe go have a coffee while the footage is rendering, but you may have different preferences. Next on our list we have opacity compensation, and this is a quite important setting because what we're actively doing is adding a number of very different looking layers on top of one another, and although I did my best to do the math right and make sure that all the channels come through correctly, sometimes the image may become just a hinge brighter or a tiny bit darker, and that's why we have opacity compensation. So why don't I lower the amount of our sources back to, let's say, 5 and demonstrate how it works. I mean, there isn't really that much to talk about. Increasing it simply increases the exposure, and decreasing it makes it darker. Now, you're probably curious about this whole idea of multiple images coming together, so why don't we just solo one of them, maybe together with the end black layer, to see how it looks. So this is our bottommost one, and you see that it's kind of blue, even on the verge of violet. The next one is in a green teal zone. We have kind of swampy green. We have a very rich red in here, and when we combine all of them, they create this nice composite that has correct colors. But if I just keep this one enabled, or maybe I should keep one of the middle ones and create just one more copy of the source, so duplicate it, you'll see that the color has changed, and that's because the distribution of that streak, the distribution of where these layers end up on a rainbow, changes dynamically with every new added layer. And if I'm not mistaken, this actually has become a tiny bit darker. Let's zoom in and see if we can see it. So I'm going to grab one of the layers and delete it very quickly, and let's see if the video capture can see it. Yep, so I could see it. I don't know if you could, but there was a tiny, almost not perceivable change in the color. And one of the ways to counteract it is simply by increasing the bit depth of your image. One of the things you're going to notice when you're using this preset is that it will automatically change your composition into 16-bit. That is, if you're using 8-bit as the original. In 8-bit, probably 5 or 4 layers would look fine. In fact, why don't we just have a look at it and see? Yeah, this looks still fine, but as you start increasing the number of layers, the mixing is not quite refined, and everything starts looking slightly like a limited palette animated GIF. 16-bit is much better for compensating for that, and 32-bit is ideal. The last setting is probably the most interesting to me personally, because it truly gives you creative control over what this effect is going to look like. And to demonstrate it, I'm going to limit my number of sources to 3 again, and that's just going to make it much easier to see. So let's zoom in here in the corner, and you can see that at the moment our image is split into 3 colors. Green is in the center, blue is being pushed outwards, and red is being pushed inwards. This is represented in here in the effects palette. If you look carefully, you will see that neutral color result is marked as green. That means that the green effect is going to move the least. It's going to be the center one, and we're going to travel on the color wheel counterclockwise and clockwise towards different colors. Now, neutral Q is the controller that allows us to change it. So if I set it to 0 degrees, now red is our neutral color. And if we look at our image, you'll see that we have red in the center and fringing occurring towards green and towards blue. And similarly, we can set it to pretty much any color we desire. This looks much more like CMYK, but it's because we have a color right between the red and the blue. How about we add a few more colors in here? Let's get back to 9. And this still works when we are creating those longer streaks. So let's 0 this thing, resulting in red being the central color, and we can see the entire rainbow going towards green and towards blue. And similarly, if we decrease it to, let's say, 120 and make blue the central color, the whole thing will shift, and you will see how drastically different effect it creates. This looks kind of cold and spacey and slightly weird and sick perhaps, while this looks much more natural, and maybe because those streaks resemble the rainbow as we tend to know it. Putting the red in the center creates yet another type of effects, and the same thing happens if we use just double source and come back to this classic duplicate look that we discussed very early. Let me lower the lens distortion back to, let's say, 5. Zoom in here on that corner. We've been looking at the top right for way too long, and just slowly scroll through different neutral hues to see the variety of results you can have. So you can have this kind of blue and orange separation, you have green and violet, pink and green, orange and blue, etc., etc. The effect is set to default at 120 degrees, which is pure green on the After Effects color wheel. The Chromatic Aberration Rig works really best when you have a very high contrast imagery, especially black and white images with, strong sources of light like stars against black background. Those work really fine, but it can be really applied to pretty much anything. So why don't we super quickly just have a look at, a few more examples. I'm gonna create a slightly smaller composition so it calculates more quickly, and I loaded a bunch of pictures in here just to show what it may look like. So here's a portrait of yours truly. It's kind of big, don't be scared. Let's scale it down. And the rig itself requires your source to be exactly the same size as your composition. Fortunately, it's already coded in, so it shouldn't cause you any problems if you try to apply it right now. So I just go to File, Scripts, Chromatic Aberration. It's going to ask me, would I like to pre-compose my layers? So this is going to happen if I have more than one layer in my composition, or if the size does not match the rest of the composition. So I click yes, and I immediately get the result. Let's quickly freak out this image, change the lens distortion to something like 30, and duplicate the hell out of the source. So I don't even know how many copies I made, but you can already see that it's creating quite cool distortion, and with much richer image, this starts looking much more like looking through the lens, especially if we probably dial back that distortion a little bit. This starts looking like observing this image through some sort of medical instrument perhaps. Let's grab another composition and see what else did I import. I have an image, I think it's a CG render of a fabric. Yep. So again, I don't really care about the size. Just go to File, Scripts, Run Script File, pre-compose it, and again I'm starting to get that separation, and it will look really good after I make a few copies. There we go. Much more delicate fringing, but it complements the image really nicely. Man, let's try one more example. I have this little pixel art I created for my wallpaper, and this unfortunately wouldn't produce very interesting results because the image doesn't have much detail happening towards the corners. So what we can do is just change the size and frame this little guy a bit better. So let's go to Composition Settings and see how much do we need to scale it. Probably around 1000 by 1000 should be fine. Maybe even less. Let's try 800 by 800. And just to demonstrate the error handling of the effect, I'm gonna switch our composition to 8 bits per channel. Zoom into 100%, select our guy and go to File, Scripts, chromatic aberration. So would you like to pre-compose your layers? You click OK, and now you see this is the new alert warning you that it has changed your project to 16-bit. Oh, this actually looks pretty cool, gives a very retro aesthetic, and probably would look even better if I make a few copies. What I wanted to show you is, if you go to your edit palette, you'll see that I included this change of the depth as a separate undo state. So if you're not happy, if you want to remain in 8-bit, you just undo once, and applying your chromatic aberration still remains, and your composition comes back to 8-bit. 16-bit is fine, especially when dealing with such small image. We can make few copies and just enjoy the results. So by now you're probably used to QubaHQ tutorials taking an extent of 1.5 hours sometimes. This one is much shorter, but I think it only showcases how easy applying this effect is and how much time you're going to be saving using it. So yeah, I guess we're going to pretty much end it here. I think it's a pretty cool beginning of the second season of QubaHQ Tutorials, and I hope you guys are going to keep coming to the website, subscribing to my channels, and following what's new. I have 2 really cool effects planned for near future. One of them is called Gifify. Yeah, it's a weird name, but it's gonna make sense once you see what it is, and it's a cool glitch effect. Another one is super glue, and it's a tracking expression that's really idiotically simple and fun to use and really helpful. So without much further ado, I think it's time to bid you farewell. For QubaHQ Tutorials, I'm Kuba Michalski, and I'll see you next time.